I was 6 when the lady appeared in my room for the first time. She stood next to my bed and watched me. When I saw her, I was understandably surprised or shocked even. But for whatever reason, I wasn't scared. I found something about her deeply comforting. She was black, but not like Mr. Davis, my teacher at the time, or like my mom's friends Daryl and Siobhan. She was black like I had never seen before. Light just seemed to disappear into her flawless skin. We gazed at one another for a minute or two, and then I trotted over to my parents' room and announced, "There's a naked lady in my bedroom." My mom snorted out a poorly stifled laugh, and Dad told me to come over, gave me a high five, and instructed me to go back to bed. But before I pulled my covers up, I reached out to poke the woman's knee, and my finger slipped through as if she wasn't there. I slept as she stared down at me. In the morning light, I could see her somewhat better, even though she still seemed to embody the night itself. She was tremendously tall, nearly brushing the ceiling with her lush hair, and her eyes, as black as the obsidian face in which they sat, had no sclera, no irises. They were like twin voids. Her teeth were also equally as dark, and it wasn't until the light caught the sheen of the saliva coating them that I knew she had any teeth at all. Days went by and my parents went in and out of my room without ever seeing the woman. If they needed to get something over where she stood, they simply passed right through as if she were a hologram. I told them about her all the time, but I only got predictable responses in return. They told me they were happy I had an imaginary friend. Dad revealed that he had one too at my age. "Not a naked lady, though," he added, winking at me. My mother just rolled her eyes and tried not to laugh. I didn't know why they thought it was so funny. Beginning the night she appeared, the black woman would talk to me. I mean, I never saw her mouth move, and I don't think I actually heard her truly say anything, but somehow I knew she was communicating with me. Sometimes when I'd have a hard time sleeping, she'd even sing to me. I didn't know what the words were, or even if they were words at all, but within minutes, I'd be dreaming. In my dreams, I could hear her whispering, just like syllables and formants. Nothing I could really understand, let alone repeat. Still, the sounds somehow made me feel stronger and more attuned to the world around me. And throughout her presence, all I felt was warmth and serenity, like I knew she loved me. 2 nights after my 7th birthday, my parents were out with Daryl and Siobhan. Our neighbor, Laura, was babysitting me. At one point, Laura dragged the telephone onto the porch to make a call, leaving me in the living room to watch TV, but I didn't mind. I liked Laura, and she was a great babysitter. She always ordered us Chinese food. Anyway, she was on the phone for a long time. I got up to get another bowl of fried rice, but as I was walking down the hall, wiggling tubes of what looked like raw, bloody muscle spontaneously sprouted from the hardwood floor. I stopped in my tracks. They pushed and pushed upward until they were nearly a foot tall. After a few seconds, they all turned and pointed toward me. Terrified, I did my best to jump over them, but I landed right inside the thicket of meaty tendrils. They tried to grasp onto my legs, but instead they moved through my limbs like ghosts. Now in a frenzy, they whipped and slashed through the air, slapping against the floor, spraying crimson blood all over the walls and ceiling. I screamed. Laura heard me and sprinted to my location. She grabbed me and checked for injuries. Then she held me as I sobbed. While in her arms, I watched more fleshy tentacles burst from the floor around us. Laura was oblivious to what I saw, and she begged me to tell her what was wrong. Then suddenly, they left me alone. Instead, they moved to Laura, wrapping around the space that she occupied until all I saw was a Laura-shaped, gore-drenched monstrosity that embraced me and promised that everything was okay. But it wasn't. The room spun and I vomited all over myself, her, and the floor. And those things disappeared. Laura washed me in the floor and then changed into one of Mom's shirts. She called the restaurant where my parents said they could be reached in case of an emergency. While I waited on the couch for them to come home, I saw serpentine undulations right below the surfaces of the walls, ceiling, and floor. When my parents returned, Laura told them what happened. After paying her and apologizing for all the puke, they wanted to hear my side of the story, so I told them. As I expected, they didn't believe a word of it. Even so, they recognized the fact that I'd been traumatized. I guess they believed that I believed what happened. As I calmed down and my more acute memories of the withering atrocities began to fade, they asked me if I'd be okay with sharing what I saw with a doctor who might be able to help. I agreed quickly. I wanted nothing more than to never see those things again. They carried me to my bed, and at my insistence, they left the light on. The black woman was there, watching me, as I curled up into a ball under my blankets. I drifted to sleep with the sound of her reassurances and soft, incomprehensible singing. I awoke near dawn to the sight of her devastated body. She was riddled with gaping holes the same width as the creatures I'd seen the night before. Her stomach had been torn open, exposing pink and yellow viscera which contrasted obscenely against her dark flesh. The eyes that once watched over me had been forced from her skull. I howled with ferocious desperation. The howl turned into a scream which turned into uncontrollable crying. My parents ran towards the sound of my agony and swept me into their arms, frantically trying to find out what was wrong, but I couldn't speak. As the sky brightened and my parents tried to comfort their morning sun, I watched through my tears as the creatures silently grew out of the floor and began to pick more flesh from the corpse. The nights leading up to my first encounter with Dr. Jessica were spent sleeping in my parents' room. I couldn't stay on my own. Whenever I went back, I was greeted by the sight of the black woman's ruined body. It looked like the creatures had taken away the parts they needed, but what they left was hideous. Tendons and gristle and fat stuck deep inside the recesses of her skeleton. The one time I ran in to grab a shirt for school, I saw one of those things curled up inside her splintered ribcage. When it noticed me, it uncoiled itself and rose like a cobra until it reached my height. A tube of glistening muscle as thick as my thigh stood at attention as I rushed in to get my shirt. I held back a sob when I saw how much bigger it was than the others I'd encountered. The death of my friend, or my episode as my parents called it, was on a Saturday. I was allowed to stay home from school on Monday, but Tuesday and Wednesday was just business as usual. I was happy for this. I loved school. My teachers enjoyed me. I had a couple friends, and I always got good grades. I was scheduled to meet the school psychologist on Friday, and I was looking forward to whatever help he might be able to provide. On Thursday morning, though, something happened. Dad and I had just finished breakfast at the dinner table, and he was taking me to school. I was looking out the window, still half asleep. It was a cloudy spring morning. The weather people on the radio had predicted thunderstorms, and for once, their forecast was accurate. A bolt of lightning lit up the sky. As I traced the jagged path, I noticed something weird. The edges of the bolt looked fuzzy, almost like the lightning was covered up in windblown fur. The bolt was too far away for me to see anything clearly, so I just chalked it up to being overtired. I'd barely slept since Friday night. In class, about halfway through a day just like any other, the storm that had been threatening us the whole morning had finally come. Now, this was southern Florida, so we're used to thunder and lightning, but this storm was abnormally strong for this time of year. Even in the summer, it would have been one the jaded locals would have commented on. Torrential rain had started, followed by small hail. Then came the lightning. It was very, very close. In his calm voice, Mr. Davis asked the students sitting in the row nearest to the window seats to sit closer to the middle of the room. I was sitting on the other side of class where the lightning struck a tree across from the soccer field. The explosion of thunder was instantaneous, and a couple kids even gasped. Even Mr. Davis jumped a little. But those reactions were only on the periphery of my attention. At the forefront of the bolt of lightning, when it struck the tree, I saw the furry edges again, but with much greater clarity than before. From this close distance, I could make out individual hairs of fur. Okay, not fur, I realized, but those vile creatures. Countless seething tendrils of raw muscle writhing around the edges of blush white plasma. As the bolt of lightning faded, so did those things. Every flash which followed had the same edges, though. I felt panic rising in my chest as I excused myself to the restroom. I sat in the stall and worked to control my breathing. The fragility of my mind state had me on the verge of crying. I rested my head in my hands and tried to hold back my emotions. The collision of heavy raindrops on the metal roof of my school seemed to mock my attempt, so I let it happen. Hot tears dripped from my brown eyes and puddled silently on the bleached tile floor. I pressed my hands into my eyes and concentrated on the fireworks display of meaningless organic shapes. I pressed my hands into my eyes and concentrated on the fireworks display of meaningless organic shapes. When my breathing slowed and the tears stopped flowing, I opened my eyes and stood up. I left the stall, turned the corner, and went to the mirror. I stopped breathing. Everything that should normally be reflected was there, except it was covered in a blanket of gore. Not just blood, but hair and veins and patches of skin. And stretching through the room like perverse pneumatic tubes were thick ropes of intestine. Bulging things traveled inside them and disappeared into the walls and the floors where the ropes were anchored. I whirled around and was greeted by the usual untainted view. Another kid, Louis, was just coming in. He greeted me with a smile, but upon seeing my pale, tear-streaked face, he furrowed his brow in concern and asked if I was okay. I turned back and looked in the mirror. Louis was standing in the same spot, but he was grotesquely deformed. One eye socket was stretched into an abyssal caldera from which the creatures poured their endless lengths onto the floor, carpeted in patches of cracked eczematus skin. Both of Louis's arms were whittled down to gleaming white bone, and his viscera was tied into an intestinal transitway that stretched the length of the room. I passed out. Apparently, when I was unconscious, part of me was awake, and all that part did was scream. I roared about snakes made of meat, and they're coming out of the lightning, and someone help us, Louis. When I woke up, both of my parents were next to me, and it looked like both of them had been crying. My face hurt and I tried to raise my hands to my cheeks, but my arms were strapped down. My legs too. I struggled until my mom came over and put her soft hand on my forehead. "It's just to make sure you're safe," she whispered. "You scratched your face up pretty badly when you were asleep." I wrinkled my cheeks and winced when I felt the swollen skin bunch up near the scrapes. I didn't say anything. After a little while, a woman who called herself Dr. Jessica came in and sat down next to me on the bed. She asked me a few basic questions like my name, my age, my favorite food. I figured she just wanted to get to know me. Then she asked if I would be comfortable if my parents left so we could have some privacy. I looked at them and they nodded as if to say it was okay, so I agreed and they went out into the hall. Dr. Jessica wanted to know what happened today and on Saturday, so I told her everything. She had a warm, supportive look on her face as I gave her the details. I worried that she'd laugh and call me crazy, but she never did. She even told me how sorry she was that the black woman had passed away. I liked Dr. Jessica. I asked her what was wrong with me, and she told me, "Sometimes kids see things that other people don't. It doesn't mean they're bad or broken or anything like that. It just means they might need some medicine to help them from seeing more scary things." I nodded and then asked if I could have that medicine. She said maybe, but she'd have to talk with my parents about it first. After a few more questions, she pressed a button near the bed and told the nurse it was okay to undo the straps on my arms and legs. Once that was done, Dr. Jessica told me I'd have to stay in the hospital for a couple of days, but she'd see me the next morning. Then she gave me a hug and left to talk to my parents outside. As I cautiously touched the scratches on my face and neck, I watched my parents and Dr. Jessica talking through the glass. Mom wiped her eyes a few times, but they both looked like they appreciated what the doctor was doing. Dad peeked his head through the door, asked me if I was okay, and then said that he and Mom and the doctor had to go down the hall to fill out some paperwork. If I needed them, he told me to press the red button next to the bed. I said okay. The room was quiet. A small, wall-mounted television displayed a baseball game without any sound. I sighed and wondered if I was crazy. I'd never heard of these things happening to anyone else. None of my friends were ever even in the hospital except for Pat when he broke his leg. But that was different. I'm different. I rubbed my eyes, being careful not to reopen any of the scratches on my face. The familiar fireworks display behind my eyelids greeted me as I modulated the pressure. When I stopped and opened my eyes, the room was blurry. I blinked a few times to get everything back into focus. Standing at the foot of my bed, towering over all the furniture in the room, was the black woman. I gasped with surprise and felt a rush of delight until I saw her disfigurements. Heavy keloid scars rose like scraps of gray leather across the totality of her flesh. Her left breast was gone, and in its place was a crater of gnarled tissue. Thin, strong forearms were crossed over her belly, but behind them were unhealed gashes. The woman, my friend, despite being alive through some sort of miracle, was in pain, agony. Still, hidden within the Bethnic depths of her eyes was the protective warmth and powerful confidence I'd grown to cherish. She turned her head to look outside. It was raining again. Lightning streaked by, its edges squirming with the coils of hellish flesh. The sound of her voice filled my mind. My parents entered the room and sat in nearby chairs. Mom was the closest to me, while my dad was by the bottom of the bed. Of course, they didn't see the woman, but she remained at her post, watching everything. They spoke to me about the medication I'd be starting tomorrow and the scheduled therapy sessions with Dr. Jessica, and although I heard them talking to me off in the distance, it wasn't what I focused on. Because now, for the first time, I could understand exactly what the black woman spoke into my head. No more syllables or formants carrying vague emotional cues. This was a statement, a warning. This will get much, much worse for you soon, and I'm so very sorry. I started to weep, and my parents did their best to comfort me. I didn't bother saying anything to them. What was there to say? They wouldn't believe a word of it anyway. Mom stroked my hair while Dad put his right hand on my mom's shoulder and reached over to hold my ankle with his left. A whisper of gentle rainfall filled the room, occasionally interrupted by my desperate whimpering. One single massive tear slid from the glistening corner of the black woman's right eye and landed on my father's index finger. Dad glanced up at the ceiling with confused annoyance and wiped his hand on the blanket.
Hey there, everyone who's listening on YouTube, or those of you who are listening on the podcast. It's me, MrCreepyPasta, and before you head out for the night, I just wanted to let you know about a couple of things. Without you, the show doesn't take place. So, if you guys would like to support the show, or if you guys would like to get your hands on a couple of cool little things whenever new things come out, check out patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta, and any support that you guys show, I really appreciate. For everyone who's already donated to the Patreon, I really appreciate it. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much for that. If you guys are looking for more CreepyPasta Storytime, there's a new video that's uploaded to this channel or uploaded to the podcast every Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and Sunday now. You can be able to get more from me at facebook.com/MrCreepyPasta or on Twitter at MrCreepyPasta and then the number 0. Thanks so much for listening, kids, and for your support. And sweet dreams.